Speaker of the House, I intend to take 10 minutes and the rest then to be shared with my colleagues, if that's okay. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this really important issue. Fianna Fáil will certainly be supporting the motion as laid out. Minister, you are well aware that broadband to this generation is what running water and electricity was to a previous generation. It is in that magnitude and it is of that importance. The digital divide between urban and rural areas and semi-urban and rural areas is brought into stark focus on a daily basis. I suppose because we've just come back here from the Christmas period, it has given us all an opportunity to spend a little bit more time with our constituents than we might normally have. And it became clear over the Christmas period as children were given gifts, new technologies were purchased in homes, just the difficulty associated with being unable to connect to the internet at speeds that are required for people to live their lives in the kind of comforts and the expectations that they have come to accept. Kids at home from college, preparing for exams, preparing reports, kids from school doing their homework, and people continuing to try to develop their small to medium enterprises in rural and semi-urban areas. Ongoing difficulties in contacting or communicating with the internet because of the slow pace of this government in rolling out broadband. No point even saying high-speed broadband to any appreciable level. And sadly, this is something that goes back to commitments that were given principally by Fine Gael back in 2012. The National Broadband Plan has been in gestation for that period of time, and I don't intend to bore the House by going back over ad nausea of all the dates and times that were missed during that period. We sadly find ourselves in a situation, Minister, where you're still supporting the principle of the competitive dialogue. We have to accept, notwithstanding what competitive dialogue processes deliver in other jurisdictions and at other times, that it is a monumental failure in the context of this particular project, because it has left us in a situation where we just have one bidder. And you've rightly identified that that requires you, and I think to quote you, was to go into the granular detail of the cost structure, something you wouldn't have had to do if others had remained in the bidding process. And I think it would be useful for you if you haven't done to date, Minister, and I do accept that since you've come to office in this particular department, you've had a lot of issues to deal with. But I think it would be worthwhile communicating with those parties that didn't remain in the process. Because if you go back and get an opportunity to read the PwC report, which set out the purpose of encouraging in those existing players, it talked about the benefits to the state of existing operators being able to leverage the infrastructure that they already had, and that infrastructure that was already in place would benefit the taxpayer in terms of being able to spread the costs over that network and benefit in terms of the speed of rollout. The competitive dialogue process has effectively pushed out those companies, I accept for different reasons, and left us with an entity that really has no experience in broadband. What we're left with at the end of the day is a private finance house out of Boston with some subcontractors here. Now, in my view, that's not a good way to proceed. It's not in the interest of the state or the people who have been waiting on the promise of high-speed broadband since 2012. I had an opportunity to engage in this process for quite some time, and the people who I talk to who are affected by this in rural and semi-urban areas are deeply frustrated because of the impact that it's having on their lives. And they don't believe anything from any side of this House at this stage, to the extent that I don't think they even tune in anymore when we talk about broadband. They just don't believe that it's going to happen. Maybe that's the strategy of some within your government, Minister, that the longer you play this out, you'll effectively burn people out and they'll make do with what they have. And that will see the continuous erosion of life in rural Ireland. We have to move on from what has happened, Minister, and we have to get to a point where the government commits to whatever you're going to commit to. Put in place whatever financial resources you have and that you're in a position to put behind this project. But I can assure you from this side of the House, nothing less than high-speed broadband to all the homes in rural Ireland, taking into account the plethora of technologies that can be deployed, and in particular to the last mile, that will still give the kind of speeds that are expected and necessary. The issues which this motion raises, the delivery of the National Broadband Plan and the competitiveness of the project, the long-term viability of the remaining bidder and the affordability, are all concerns which are shared by us on this side of the House and which have been previously expressed. I don't propose to rehearse the timeline for how we got to this point, other than to provide my own understanding of the situation we find ourselves in, within days of the award of one of the largest contracts this state has seen in modern times. The former Minister for Communications has resigned. We know about that, and we know why that happened as a result of his inappropriate communications with David McCourt of Granahan McCourt, the sole remaining bidder. If Granahan McCourt's bid is not accepted, there is no clear pathway to the delivery of the plan. If it is accepted, I think questions remain as to the capacity of that entity, based on its experience or lack thereof, to deliver against the exacting timelines, to deliver in an environment where the availability of contractors is questionable, based on the limit of skilled personnel in the state and outside to provide this service. So whatever plan you intend to announce, Minister, it is vitally important that you're upfront and honest, that you set out from the start clear timelines as to when you expect a tender to be signed, when you expect work to begin, the rate at which work will be completed, and when the final connection is to be made. Now, that's really important, and we need to see what areas, what counties, what regions are to be delivered within particular timescales and timelines. And that will be a difficult political decision for you, Minister. It's a difficult political decision for the government. We all get that. But at least if you're upfront and honest, and people know that it's Q4 of 2021, or it's Q3 of 2022, or it's Q1 of 2025 before it's completed. People will accept that if it's real, if it's verifiable, and if they can expect, based on your recommendations, that that's going to happen. What we don't need is another fudge. What we don't need is soft language that gives everybody a sense of a warm feeling. That won't work anymore, because people are absolutely burnt. They'll accept that it's going to be longer than they had originally envisaged, so long as you set it out in clear terms. However, I think that the issues related to the National Broadband Plan date back much further than some of the issues that have been arranged. And by the time the former minister met with McCourt in New York, both Cyro and Ayr had dropped out, and SSE were soon to follow. That speaks to the difficulties that existed, in my view, with the competitive dialogue process. And I think it's important, Minister, that government takes stock of what has happened and tries to ascertain how or why it has happened in this way, so that the same process isn't used again. I think, sadly, the Peter Smith's report skirted around the issue. I think he failed to accept that there was a lobbying intent by Mr McCourt. All these meetings, all these texts, all these phone calls didn't happen because Mr McCourt liked the minister, or the minister liked him, or that they needed to be having meals and dinners and texts on that kind of a basis. They did so, or in the case of Mr McCourt, in my view, did so on the basis that he was seeking to curry favour with the government and curry favour with the minister. And in my view, that breaches the principles that are set out in the guidelines for bidding for this particular project. And I think any fair-minded assessment of it, and I think you complimented Mr Smith, I think Mr Smith delivered what the government wanted. When I questioned him before a committee, he made it very clear that he has never had an adverse finding in any of his audit reports. That seems bizarre, that at no time that he has had an adverse finding. He failed, in my view, to look at the basic issue of canvassing. He does accept that canvassing took place at a minimum at the dinner in New York only because there was a minute of the meeting. He accepts the word of the Minister and Mr McCourt on at least 3 occasions when they held private meetings. He accepts their assertion that the National Broadband Plan was never discussed. Now, I don't want to assign the wrongdoing to any individual, but I think it's virtually impossible to believe that no discussion took place around the National Broadband Plan between those two individuals when they met on at least 3 occasions with no officials present. And I'll conclude on that, Ceann Comhairle.